And now we move to our next speaker and the last speaker of the today's session, Professor Narendra Dixit. Professor Narendra Dixit is a professor in the Chemical Engineering Department and currently a chair of Biosystem Science and Engineering, and very dear colleague. And Narendra's lab focuses on the mathematical models to understand the biology and the interaction, host pathogen interaction, specifically with the viral and bacterial pathogens. And we will hear Narendra about modeling the effects of the SARS-CoV-2. Narendra, can you please turn on video and audio?
Are you, Deepshika, thank you very much. Are you able to see me?
1 minute. Yeah, I am able to see you. We are able to see you, Narendra. Yes.
Okay, and you're able to hear me as well, I guess.
Yes. Yes. We are able to hear you quite clearly. If you can share your slides and put it in the. Yes, sure.
Are my slides visible as well?
Yeah, they're visible. If you can only put it in the full screen mode. Yeah, now it's fine.
Thank you very much, Deepshika, for those very kind words. It's also good to see you in these pandemic times. We don't see each other very much. My thanks also to Shashank and the organizers of this lovely symposium for this opportunity to talk about our work. Like Deepshika said, our work is on modeling of virus infections. And in this particular case, I'll talk a little bit about entry inhibitors of SARS-CoV-2 and also about neutralizing antibodies. I realize we're running late and I stand between all of us and lunch. So for those of us who are not interested in modeling, now is the time to switch off and get an early lunch perhaps. I must confess that we haven't generated new data, but we have developed models that we hope provide insights into the data that is getting generated, and we hope that these insights will help us translate some of the findings to the clinic a lot sooner. So let me get on with the talk. There are two parts to this talk. The first is on entry inhibitors, and here I'll talk a little bit about synergy that we feel is likely to emerge between inhibitors that block host proteases, TMP-RSS2 and cathepsin BL. And also I'll talk a little bit about how we are able to estimate the relative usage of these two proteases by the virus for entry into different cell types and how this also may have implications for treatments. The second part, we'll look at neutralizing antibodies. And here we've tried to put together what I call the quantitative landscape of the responses of neutralizing antibodies. This will help us rank order and benchmark these antibodies and perhaps select the best ones for clinical development. And then it also helps us recapitulate patient responses. So before I move forward, maybe I should follow Professor Tatu and mention that all of this work has been done by collaborators Pranesh and Rajat. Pranesh is at the University of Queensland and Rajat works at Certara. So let me begin with the first part. Let's look at SARS-CoV-2 entry inhibitors. The reason we're looking at this is the following. As you heard from Professor Sumit Chanda in the morning, there's a great need for identifying synergistic drug combinations. And we feel that SARS-CoV-2 entry inhibitors offer that opportunity. Why is that? So in a recent study, we looked at SARS-CoV-2 dynamics in 13 patients, and they estimated that repurposed drugs had an efficacy of around 20 to 70%, very wide variation. But none of the drugs came anywhere close to what they estimated also as the desired efficacy of 80% for there to be a sufficient block of the infection that might lead eventually to cure. Now, one could hope that increasing concentrations of the drugs might lead us to these higher efficacies, but then everybody realizes that there will be toxicities to deal with. So one therefore looks for synergy so that efficacies can be raised without having to contend with increased corresponding toxicities. So we feel that entry inhibition could be an avenue for realizing that synergy. Why? As we have heard in several talks in the morning, the virus enters cells through two what look like independent pathways. So after attachment of its spike protein to these ACE2 receptors on the cell surfaces, there are host proteases, either TMPRSS2 or cathepsin BLs, that are required for the cleavage of the spike protein or the activation of the spike proteins for this entry process to fructify. Now, these are independent in the sense that TMPRSS2 works at the cell membrane and cathepsin BLs work after the virus is actually endocytosed, and they work inside these endosomes. Either pathway will lead eventually to infection. So now you can imagine blocking some of these pathways. So if, for example, you had a drug that could block TMPRSS2, that would reduce infection perhaps to a certain extent, but the other pathway of entry would remain accessible to the virus. Similarly, if you blocked cathepsins, the entry through the TMPRSS2 pathway would continue. Only when you block both pathways would you completely be able to protect a cell from infection. So this need to block both pathways can translate in a clinical setting or even in an in vitro setting into a synergy, and we are trying to see if that can be realized. Now, are these pathways targetable? There are actually drugs that can do that. So, for example, Camostat mesylate is a TMPRSS2 inhibitor. It's been approved in Japan for other conditions. And another drug, Nafamostat mesylate, is in clinical trial in India by Sun Pharma. Cathepsin BL inhibitors are under development. The one that's actually approved for clinical use for other conditions is hydroxychloroquine. And in many cases, monotherapy with hydroxychloroquine has been found poorly efficacious. So it's not likely to be used alone. But when you use these in combination, perhaps if they are able to extract this mechanism of synergy, then they might actually be fruitful. And clinical trials that use both these in combination are actually underway. So let's see if there's any synergy that's likely to arise. And I must mention here that this synergy is actually counterintuitive, because you also heard from Professor Sumit Chanda in the morning that if you target this using multiple drugs the same step, you might actually not expect synergy. So we'll see whether this actually really works out. So we looked at it using a mathematical model, first to prove to ourselves that the synergy is possible, and then we'll look at whether any data supports this claim. How do we think about this process? We have cells in culture which are exposed to the virus. Now these cells are susceptible to infection, and we assume that that susceptibility is dependent on the expression level of these proteases. So if you have a lot of TMPRSS2, for example, then you'll be more susceptible to entry through the TMPRSS2 pathway. And if you have, let's say, a lot of cathepsin BLs, then you might be more susceptible to entry through that pathway. And we assume that there is a distribution of the expression levels of these proteases. And as a result, the efficacies of drugs that block those proteases will also be affected. So if you have a drug that blocks cathepsins, in a cell that has high cathepsin expression, its efficacy is likely to be low. And similarly for drugs that block TMPRSS2. Now, how do we go about thinking about what happens when such cells are infected, are exposed to the virus? Just to begin quantification, I'm not going to put up a lot of equations, but some quantification might help. So we think of the expression level of some protein, in this case TMPRSS2, to follow a log normal distribution. That's been shown here in this blue curve. And the susceptibility of cells to follow a sigmoidal pattern with respect to this expression level. So at low expression levels, you're not susceptible to entry through that pathway. At very high expression levels, the susceptibility becomes almost 100%. So the susceptibility can also be thought of as the probability of successful entry per virus cell contact. So now you think about cells that have different expression levels of this particular protein. This is just an illustration. We'll think very quickly about both proteases being expressed on cells. Each cell, for example, depending on what its expression level is of this particular protease, will become susceptible to infection by the virus. So these cells, for example, independently can proliferate, they can die, they can contract the infection through this virus, that they become then infected, and these infected cells can produce more of these viruses. Now this infectivity, we argue, is limited by the susceptibility. Now the cells that have low expression levels of these proteins will have low susceptibilities. Cells that have high expression levels of these proteins will have high susceptibilities. So this is how this infection proceeds. Now the virus particles that are produced from each of these cell types can actually go and infect all of these cell types independently, and that's how all of these cells are coupled in culture. Now, what happens when you have drugs present? We recognize that these drugs will block the functioning of some of these proteins. We can show using reaction equilibrium calculations that the free proteins or proteases in this particular case that are available to function get reduced by drugs in this particular Hill function type manner relative to what you had in the absence of this drug. So the more drug one has, the greater the reduction of free proteases, and therefore the lower the susceptibility. Now the susceptibility is actually a function of the free proteins that are available, or free proteases that are available. So as you increase the drug levels, the susceptibilities of each of these cells will change, it will decrease, and it will decrease in a way that is dependent on how the level of free proteases changes as a function of this particular concentration. Now, how do we measure the effect of the drug? We measure it using what we call the fraction of cells that remains unaffected by the drug. So that's actually really the cells, the cells that are infected in the presence of the drug relative to the cells that are infected in the absence of the drug. So if this ratio is 1, the drug's not doing very much. If this ratio is 0, the drug has been able to block all infections. So this is basically a measure for us of how the drug acts. So we now use this metric and look at what happens when we expose these cells to both these protease inhibitors, TMPRSS2 inhibitors as well as cathepsin BL inhibitors. So we must recognize that both these proteases will have a distribution of their expression levels across cells. These distributions are independent. Now, if you take any one cell, it will have a particular expression level of this protease, and another expression level of this protease. And so it will be susceptible to entry through both these entry pathways. And we assume that those susceptibilities are independent. So they're like independent coin tosses. Any one of them that gives you heads will let you enter. So this is how we calculate the total susceptibility of cells to infection through both pathways. And now we can look at what happens when these pathways are blocked by drugs. TMPRSS2 inhibitors will reduce this quantity, this susceptibility. Cathepsin BL inhibitors will reduce this quantity. And so we now can look at what happens when all of them, when both these drugs are simultaneously present. We can calculate and quantify synergy using the following metric. So if I now compute the fraction unaffected when both the drugs are present, and the fraction that would be predicted to be unaffected if both those drugs were to act independently. Right? So that's called the Bliss independence metric. So if you have Bliss independence, then the fraction unaffected by one drug multiplied by the fraction unaffected by the other drug is the total fraction that will be unaffected by both the drugs. So if there is synergy, this number would be even lower than this product. So the drugs together are actually preventing infection of more cells than what you would have expected if the drugs were to act independently. If that happens, then you have synergy. So now we look at our model. We can write differential equations for the dynamics of all of those populations that I showed you in the previous slide, and ask what happens to these quantities Fu and Bliss synergy as a function of the drug concentrations. So I'll show here this Fu as that's predicted by our model as a function of the concentrations of these drugs. Now, several cases are there here. This is what happens if you have cathepsin blockers alone. This is what will happen if you have TMPRSS2 blockers alone, and this is what happens when you have both of them together. Now, how do we read this? As the concentration of one of the drugs increases, initially, of course, when we have very little of the drug, everything is getting infected. So the fraction unaffected by the drug is 100%. As the drug levels increase, this fraction comes down, but in this particular case, it saturates at some level. And in this particular case, it's saturating at 78%. What this means is at this level, all the cathepsins are blocked by the drug, but there's entry of the cells, that is entry of the virus into cells that's still taking place through the TMPRSS2 pathway. And in this particular case, the expression level of TMPRSS2 is such that 78% of the cells are still getting infected. In this case, the same happens with a TMPRSS2 blocker. Here, all the TMPRSS2 are blocked, but 39% of the cells are still getting infected because of the cathepsin pathway that is still accessible. Now, if you had these drugs working independently, one would have expected through this kind of a calculation that when both those drugs are used at these levels, then the total fraction that would still be infected would be 30%. But what you find really is that nothing's getting infected, because actually, I mean, that's intuitive. All of the proteases are completely blocked. So no entry happens. Now, this really is the synergy. This gap between what would have happened if you had independence of the drugs and what happens in reality is what you call synergy. That's Bliss synergy. It's also called vertical synergy in this particular case. So now we can span this. This calculation has been illustrative. It's been done at a particular fixed concentration of both the drugs, but you can vary the concentrations independently. So here's spanning cathepsin inhibitors, TMPRSS2 inhibitors. This is what would be expected by Bliss independence. This is what happens when we use our model. And the difference between these two is actually synergy. And you see that the synergy actually continues to increase as the concentrations of each of these drugs rises. So this is hope that there is actually a possibility of combining these drugs and having their efficacies be better than what would have happened if the drugs were used independently and thus also contain toxicities. Now, is there any evidence of this? So we looked at the literature to see whether these drugs have been used in combination. And fortunately for us, there were several studies that used camostat and a cathepsin BL inhibitor in conjunction. So this is the kind of data that is available. These are pseudovirus entry assays in cell lines showing entry with either SARS spike protein pseudoviruses or SARS-CoV-2 pseudoviruses. And what you will find is the levels of entry, from which we can actually calculate these FUs, which is the fraction unaffected by these drugs, and use our simple expectation versus observed calculation to look at synergy. So this is what will give you FU with one drug, FU with another drug, and FU when both are used. And because you have FUs independently available, you can also calculate what should have happened if these drugs were to act independently. And what we find is that in all cases, there's quite a bit of synergy that is seen between these drugs. Now, there are this is seen for both SARS-CoV-2 and SARS, both actually use the same set of pathways for entry. This is across cell lines and across different cathepsin inhibitors, although done with the same TMPRSS2 inhibitor. So this is suggesting that there's quite a bit of evidence that this synergy is likely. Of course, this is in vitro. Whether this will work out in vivo remains to be seen. The next question we asked is, where does this synergy actually come from? Right, so to elucidate that, we did a very quick calculation. To cut a long story short, we find that the synergy comes from both interactions with the drugs at the single cell level and at the cell population level. And you can see this is quite intuitive. So to elucidate this, to look at what happens at the single cell level, we reran our calculations, but allowing all cells to be identical. All cells express both TMPRSS2 and cathepsin, but at fixed level. So there's actually no difference between one cell and another. So no cellular heterogeneity. When you do this, you again see synergy. And you see synergy now because if you use just one drug, as I said earlier, you block one pathway, but the other pathway remains accessible. If you use the other drug, you block the other pathway at high levels, but the earlier pathway remains accessible. It's only when you use both drugs at saturating levels that you find both pathways being blocked, and then you see the synergy. Now you can also see synergy at what we call the cell population level. Now to see this, we did this extreme calculation where we said cells either express TMPRSS2 or cathepsin, but not both. So in some cells, you'll have entry possible only through one pathway. In another set of cells, you have entry possible through the other pathway. Now you expose this population, which contains these heterogeneous cell types, but with extreme heterogeneities, to the drugs. So when you have TMPRSS2 inhibitors alone, you protect a certain population of cells, but the others are fully susceptible. On the other hand, when you use the other drug, you protect these latter cells, but the first cells now become fully susceptible. It's only when you use both drugs that you can prevent the entire population of cells and therefore protect the cells from infection. And that's how you again get synergy. So you have synergy playing out both at the single cell level and at the cell population level. And we find this is actually a novel mechanism of synergy which is operating at both levels and could be harnessed in vivo. Now the question is, when would each of these mechanisms be operative and to what extents? And depending on that, how do we tune drug treatments? So we extended our model and we realized that from our model, we could actually tell which of these pathways is being used to what extent in different cell types. And to again cut a long story short, if you use saturating drug levels, then we can show that the ratios of these FUs that I talked about in the presence of one drug versus in the presence of both the drugs, actually some of the two put together, gives you the relative usage of these pathways. Right? So we can apply this using data that's already available in the literature and calculate or estimate at least what's the relative usage of these two pathways across different cell lines. And we did this for SARS-CoV and SARS-CoV-2. And here's what we find. These are cell lines here on the x-axis and the relative usage on the y-axis. Cyan is cathepsin usage and blue is TMP-RSS2 usage. So immediately you will see that depending on the cell line, there's actually quite a spectrum of usages. So 293 cells use only the cathepsin pathway. Calu cells use mostly only the TMP-RSS2 pathways, and Vero cells, for example, will use something intermediate. And this usage, with the spectrum of usages is actually common between SARS-CoV and SARS-CoV-2. It's quite similar. So what are the implications of all of this? So this I already said that it varies widely across cell lines. Now, and that it's similar. If you now look at cells, for example, like TMP-RSS2, which use both pathways to comparable levels, then you will expect in these cell types that you will get synergy at the single cell level based on the mechanism that I just talked about. On the other hand, if you have a mixture of cell lines, mixture of cell types that use either one or the other pathway exclusively, then when you expose these cell types to these drugs, you will actually get population level synergy. Now, the cell tropism of this virus is only becoming fully revealed, and we expect that this diverse spectrum of usages is likely to be there in vivo, in which case combinations of these drugs will be able to harness synergies both at the single cell level and at the cell population level, and therefore we hope that there actually be a potent combination to look at. So that's where I'll close with the first part of my talk and switch gears. By the way, this is to appear in PLOS Computational Biology shortly. I'll switch over to the second part of my talk, which is to look at SARS-CoV-2 neutralizing antibodies. And so here's the reason we started looking at this. SARS-CoV-2 neutralizing antibodies are being discovered at a phenomenal pace. It's also been called pandemic pace. There are over 100 of them that have been reported so far, and new ones are being reported almost on a daily basis. So now the question is, how do we compare all of these antibodies and which ones do we take forward to the clinic? Already some are in clinical trials, maybe even approved as we speak. So what one does normally is to use something called the IC50, which is a 50% inhibitory concentration. But the studies with HIV and hepatitis C have shown us that this is actually not a very good measure of the efficacy of these antibodies, and might not be a good way to compare them. The reason is that the slope of the dose response curves also makes a big difference in how these antibodies act. So why is that? Let me illustrate that using this cartoon. So this is, for example, the fraction unaffected again of cells when they are exposed to this virus as a function of the concentration of the antibodies that might be there in the milieu. So as the antibody concentrations increases, this fraction unaffected drops, so many more cells are protected. This is now 3 antibodies, for example, that have 3 different IC50s. So one would typically pick this one because it has a low IC50. But then you can have these slopes, these curves exhibiting different slopes. When that happens, what happens is the following. This is now plotting the same thing on a log scale, right? And then what you will find, the red is one antibody, the black one is another antibody. The red one actually has a lower IC50, but it turns out has a lower slope of this curve. In which case, when you use these drugs at clinical concentrations, the efficacy of this black antibody is actually better than the efficacy of the red antibody. So this is telling us that you can't really rely on IC50 alone to compare these antibodies. So how do we then go about comparing them? This problem was addressed in the HIV field, and a metric called the instantaneous inhibitory potential was constructed, which combines both these IC50s and the slopes and offers a better way to compare these antibodies. And what we've done, and which is what I'm going to talk about, is actually use this metric, apply them to several of the antibodies, maybe 70 of them that we could manage of these antibodies, and look at how we can compare these antibodies. So here's the approach. We collated data from a whole lot of published sources. We digitized the dose response curves, like the ones that I talked to you about in the previous slide. And then we analyzed these using standard dose response curve slopes or the median effect equations, which I will talk about in a minute. And then we computed the IIP for each of these antibodies and then rank ordered them. Now, these dose response curves are basically looking at pseudovirus exposure of cells. Pseudoviruses are viruses with different backbones that have SARS-CoV-2 spike proteins expressed on them. And when cells are exposed to these viruses at different concentrations, they with these viruses, but with different concentrations of the antibodies, different amounts of these cells get infected, and that is measured as a dose response curve. So what do we find? Here's the analysis. This is FA now. This is the fraction affected, which is 1 minus the fraction unaffected. And this now has a Hill function type dependence on the dose of the antibody that has been used. These are these dose response curves, fraction affected as a function of the concentration of the antibody. This is the representative set of antibodies, 4 of them. The reason we have shown this here is that they display to you the spectrum of slopes that you see of these dose response curves, going all the way from very low slopes, slope of 0.48. So slope here is this quantity m. IC50 is already something that we all know. That's the concentration at which this FU becomes half or 50%. So this is a low slope, increasing slope, much higher slope, very high slope. And this is also evident when you transform this equation into what has been called as the median effect equation. It's the same equation but written in a different form. Then this quantity, the log of this FA by FU, becomes it depends on this log concentration in a straight line manner, and then the fitting of course is a lot easier, and you can clearly see how these slopes vary. Now you can perform this analysis and estimate both the IC50s and the slopes. And we did that for a lot of antibodies, and I'm showing here a snapshot. This is basically to tell you that most antibodies actually are amenable to analysis like this. And we now get a spectrum of slopes and IC50 values. And I'll show you what we find. This is the distribution of IC50 values. Each dot here is a particular antibody, and this is the corresponding distribution of slopes. So you'll see a very wide variation, several orders of magnitude variation in the IC50 value, which is expected, and also correspondingly a very wide variation in the value of the slope. This is something that has been ignored in the comparisons that people have made using the IC50s alone. This is just to prove that our analysis is accurate, because the IC50s are also reported in each of these studies, and our estimated values are basically identical to those reported values. Now, where is this variation coming from? It's not coming, it turns out, from the backbone used for conducting these pseudovirus assays. It doesn't depend on the backbone of the virus, whether it's HIV, VSV, etc. It also doesn't depend on the cell line. You see this variability across cell lines. So this variability is really intrinsic to the antibodies. So there are antibodies that have different values of the IC50, different values of the slope. So now we can use them to estimate the IIP. What's the IIP? It's the log decline in viremia in a single round infection assay. So if you take the pseudovirus assay, or if you take virus assays and you allow replication to happen over a single round, with and without the antibodies, if you look at now at the viremia that results, and the change in the viremia in log scale is what this IIP stands for. So the larger the IIP, the greater the decline in the viremia as a result of the effect of this intervention. And in this particular case, it's the antibodies. Because we know the IC50 and the slopes, we can calculate this IIP. It's typically done at a dose of 100 micrograms per ml, which is sort of a clinical dose. Changes in this don't make a difference. You can do this at 50 and you'll still get more or less the same answer. And what's shown here is the result. This shows antibodies plotted as a function of their slopes and IC50 values, and color coded based on their IIPs, the resulting IIPs. So the low IIPs are here, they are in red, and as you cut across like this, the IIPs increase. These lines here are contours associated with fixed IIPs. So you'll find that low IC50s and low slopes give you low IIPs and so on. And so the IIPs actually increase like this. They cut across with the negative slope, negative 45 degree slope. So what you find when you look at this, by the way, this is the landscape of the antibody response. So this is about 70 different antibodies. So when we look at how this IIP is distributed, you find most antibodies actually have low IIPs. They're not very efficacious, but there are a few that have high IIPs, 4 and 5. A few of them are actually above 5. So these we believe are the best antibodies. These are the ones that one would take for further development, hoping that they'd actually be promising in terms of their ability to prevent infections. Now, how representative are these of patients? So that's what we asked. Of course, this is just to show you that we can actually now rank order these antibodies in terms of the IIPs, and this could be a way to compare all of the antibodies that are currently available. So we did this analysis, fortunately, with available data from individual patients. So what I've shown here is, again, the variability in the IC50 and the variability in the slope of the different antibodies that were isolated from individual patients from convalescent sera. So you'll find each patient actually had many 7, 8, 10 antibodies that could be isolated. And then these antibodies were used in pseudovirus assays and looked at the FUs and so on, and we could then again do the dose response curve analysis and estimate the IC50s and the slopes, and this is what we found. So the same spectrum of variability was there again within each individual, and when we now mapped all these antibodies on our landscape, we found quite a similar looking landscape, similar variability in IC50s, similar variability in the slopes. The variability was slightly lower, but that's expected perhaps because these were samples collected about 30-40 days after the patients had the infection. So maybe there was some fading away of the antibodies, but still the spectrum was representative of what you might have found from the antibodies that have been suggested as promising and for further developments. So now we could try to mimic also what how individual patient responses could be quantified. So from this landscape, for example, we could sample 10 antibodies at random, assuming that those would be the antibodies that might be produced in response to the infection in an individual, and look at how those antibodies would neutralize the virus. And that has been studied using plasma dilution assays in the clinic. So we could mimic those plasma dilution assays. So here each gray line tells you what this plasma dilution assay is likely to be. Each gray line for us is one individual patient whose antibody response is a random sampling of the antibodies from the landscape that I had described earlier. And then you now look at the fraction unaffected as a function of this plasma dilution. So as you dilute the plasma, the fraction unaffected goes up. So more and more cells are getting infected. So you look for what this dilution should be as a measure of how strong the antibody response is. The larger the dilution is for getting, let's say, 50% FU, the stronger the original antibody response was in that individual. Now these blue lines are these dilution assays of 3 individual patients reported in this particular study. So our antibody dilution assays that we mimicked in silico were able to recapitulate some of the dilution assays that have been seen in these patients, and we now get the distribution of what are called these NT50s. The NT50 is the dilution that gives you 50% FU compared to the starting point. So you find the spectrum of NT50s. In general, this NT50 is a measure that's used, for example, to decide on whether a particular convalescent plasma could be used for treating other people. So the higher the NT50, the more potent that particular plasma is likely to be. So here we again want to highlight the importance of looking at the slopes of these plasma dilution assays in addition to the NT50 values. Now, these NT50s are actually directly correlated to the IC50s of the individual antibodies that constitute this antibody milieu in the plasma. So to illustrate that, we did this particular in silico calculation. So what we did was looked at 2 sets of in silico virtual patients. We sampled antibodies in for representative of these 2 groups, let's say, that had very similar IC50s. They were IC50 matched. But then we let the slope of the dose response curves be different in these 2 groups. So when we now repeated these plasma dilution assays, as expected, the NT50s were very similar because they'd map onto the IC50s, but the IIPs were very different, with the group B, which had the higher slopes, registering much higher IIPs, and therefore these plasmas actually being more potent than these plasmas. So this is suggesting to us that going forward, antibody therapy or even plasma therapy may be better off choosing combinations that have both low NT50s and high slopes of the dose response curves. So that's where I'll stop. To summarize, so this piece of work is available as a preprint for those of you who are interested. In summary, we can show that TMPRSS2 and cathepsins can be targeted simultaneously in a synergistic manner and that may actually help dealing with SARS-CoV-2 infection better than otherwise. The synergy is novel. It arises both from a single cell and cell population level. We can also estimate the relative usage of the pathways across different cell lines, and this suggests that both these synergy mechanisms could potentially be at play if these combinations were used in vivo. SARS-CoV-2 neutralizing antibodies exhibit a wide spectrum of IC50 and dose response curve slopes. The most potent antibodies in our study had IIPs greater than 5, and this could be a benchmark for future antibodies, as there are new antibodies that are coming up every day. For them to become promising as candidates for future development, they must display IIPs that are comparable to the best ones that are currently available. A combination of diverse antibodies spanning the landscape actually defines patient responses, and antibody therapy could seek combinations that have high dose response curves slopes. So I'd like to thank India Alliance for funding, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you all might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Narendra, for a wonderful talk. And there are time for a few questions. So the question by Sashank Tripathi. Are all the neutralizing antibodies against the spike region? And if yes, then why there is a variability in the efficacy?
Yeah, so great question, Shashank. Most of them are neutralizing in the sense that they block entry. Whether they target specifically the spike protein and which region within the spike protein is not something that has been identified in the original studies. With some antibodies, the actual targets are known. With others, they are not known. And also, in some cases, while the binding of the antibodies to the spike proteins has been demonstrated, their ability to block the binding of the spike proteins with the ACE receptors has not been demonstrated, in the sense that the spike proteins can still bind ACE and enter cells, even though sometimes the spike proteins can be blocked by these antibodies. So there is a spectrum of effects, including multi-protein interactions, that defines the kinds of efficacies that one is seeing. Studies are ongoing to decide or to unravel the sites on the spike proteins that are actually targeted by the different antibodies, and they might actually help understand the ranges of the efficacies that are seen.
Thanks. Thanks. Next question by Amit, that how can one measure the synergy if only a minor fraction of the cell express one protease type, while the other protease maybe constitute a major fraction? So is it possible to, in fact, measure the synergy in this scenario?
So that's a great question. So what, if I understood correctly, there's one protease that is available on all cells and expressed in large amounts, and a small percentage of the cells is actually allowing expression of another protease, and you want to see whether synergy happens. That's maybe difficult to measure, because the assays will all be dominated by what happens with the protein that is expressed in large amounts. But one can actually start blocking that particular protease using drugs at very high levels that can block that protein. And if you still see residual infection, that will give you an indication that a small set of cells is allowing the usage of the other protease that is expressed. But the assays have to be really sensitive for one to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Mathematically, one can do this, but experimentally may be tricky. Sorry.
Okay. So last question by Professor Raghavan Varadarajan is, how long after the infection do you think that antibody treatment will be efficacious?
That's a good question. Antibody treatment, so this will depend quite a bit on the dynamics of the infection, in the sense that natural infection is resolved in a few weeks. So if you're talking about starting antibody treatment, let's say within days of the infection, one will have to look at the dosage that one has to use. If one waits many weeks, then either the infection is already resolved or there's some residual infection, and in which case the antibodies might not necessarily help very much. But the answer to this is actually more nuanced, Raghavan, because if you use passive antibody treatment while the infection is still ongoing, then the germinal center reactions are altered. And that can actually produce long-term effects, as has been seen with HIV infection, which might allow antibody treatments to be effective even without passive immunization beyond a certain point, maybe much more longer term than one would have imagined. But let's say if you start antibody treatment a week from, let's say, the onset of an infection, I would imagine, depending on the dosages that are used, that it might actually be quite potent.
Thank you. Thanks, Narendra, for the wonderful insight and all the questions. Now, I would like to thank the speakers from our session, Professor Soumitra Das, Dr. Chitra Pattabhiraman, Professor Utpal Tatu, and Professor Narendra Dikshit for giving really very deep insight into the clades, into the different intervention strategies, as well as into specifically with respect to Karnataka by Chitra, and Professor Utpal Tatu's proteomics approach, and Professor Narendra's mathematical modeling approach, with an overall pangenomic sequencing by Professor Soumitra Das. It was indeed an extremely insightful knowledge that we have gained in this particular session. I would like to thank Dr. Shashank Tripathi for organizing this amazing symposium, and the head of CIDR, Professor Balaji. And thanks, Shashank, for giving me this opportunity to moderate this session. I indeed learned a lot from this session, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Deepshika, for taking out time to handle this session. It was conducted very well.